All right, so my name is Eric Gallant. I'm a professor of weed ecology and management at the University of Maine, and I'm really only here at the University of Maine because Matt is no longer here. It's my real pleasure to introduce and welcome back to the University of Maine a longtime friend, colleague, and mentor, Matt Liebman. He's the Wallace Chair for Sustainable Agriculture at Iowa State University and a professor. Matt came to UMaine in 1987, and in 1988, along with colleagues, some of whom are in this room, started the first BS undergraduate program in sustainable agriculture in the United States. The first of its kind, which now is still thriving and has around 38 students, and has inspired a great number of farmers and scientists over the years. His students and postdocs are leading members of the sustainable agriculture community across the United States, in Central America and South America, and in private companies as well. And one thing that really inspired me, Matt has always impressed me as believing in the potential of a motivated student. Despite his seemingly vast and deep knowledge of sustainable agriculture, if you could talk to Matt about something or bring up a question, and he never made you feel stupid, never felt like it was a stupid question. It was just that you hadn't thought about that or you hadn't learned it yet. And he believed so much so that he hired me as a postdoc, converting a biochemist into, I guess, an average agroecologist today. Matt is a prolific author. He really believes that it is our obligation when we take money to do research that we have to tell people about it. It is not okay to have all those languishing data sets sitting on your shelves. I have a few of those. He has published over 140 publications and literally wrote the book on ecologically based weed management. Which, by the way, is now available online thanks to some enthusiastic Ukrainians. Sorry about those royalties, Matt. Matt's research has even made it into the New York Times, with Mark Bittman authoring a piece called A Simple Fix for Farming, which described the benefits of longer, more diversified rotations. And that's based on the work of an agronomist. So there are not many agronomic pieces that make it into the New York Times. So his research continues to be foundational in expanding our understanding of mechanisms related to the ecology and population dynamics of weeds, and the key regulators of weeds in cropping systems. And notable is the fact that despite his efforts in this area, which have clearly contributed to reductions in herbicide use, it's all in the broader context of sustainability related to soil quality, related to diversification, related to improving or reducing contamination of surface and groundwater. So it's my great pleasure to welcome a friend and colleague back to Maine, Matt Liebman.
Well, thanks a lot for turning out. I sort of feel like I'm here to explain what I've done in the last 19 or 20 years of my life and report that almost everything that I've been able to do and the kinds of work that I've engaged in since leaving Orono were really motivated by the experiences I had here, the interactions I had with people, the insights that they shared with me. So I arrived here on Friday, and I had the pleasure of interacting with a number of you over the weekend and Friday afternoon. And I'm really struck by the fact that really everything I've been doing has been driven by 11 or 12 years I spent here. And the kinds of questions I've been able to address and the methods and the organization that I've worked within have really been affected by you all. So I thank you so much for that. All right, so let me tell you a little bit where I'm from now. This is from the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Goddard Flight Center, and they do imagery of the Earth. And if you go over the Earth and you look at the electron emissions from photosynthesis taking place, the central corn belt, which is me here, the bulk of the corn belt, is the most biologically productive place on Earth in the middle of the summer. It beats the Amazon in terms of the amount of net primary production taking place. So this is photosynthesis central right here. And that's where I live and that's where I work. And we produce a rather large amount of crop commodities and the associated livestock and alcohol products that come from those crop commodities. Iowa typically ranks at the top or near the top of corn and soybean producers. We're the #1 producer of hogs and pigs, #1 producer of eggs, #1 producer of ethanol, and I think we rank somewhere 5th to 7th in cattle production for beef. So we produce a whole lot of primary crop commodities. But it didn't always look that way. When Euro-American settlers came about a century and a half ago, they found a mixture of oak savanna, grasslands, and seasonal wetlands. And it was a very diverse habitat, and perhaps more important from an ecological point of view, it was characterized by vegetation that provided deep roots and continuous living cover. Most of the water went towards the sky as evapotranspiration. It either evaporated from small wetland ponds or through the plants as transpiration. Relatively little water went through the soil, and nutrients were retained in the soil by those roots and transpiring leaves. Minimized erosion, and it provided habitat for numerous forms of wildlife. So this is native prairie vegetation, and you can see these roots extended a considerable depth, very high density, a lot of carbon being added to that root rhizosphere area, and that's what resulted in some of the richest, most productive soils in the world. So we've transformed that prairie landscape into what this looks like. So this is a county. There are 99 of these in Iowa. Yellow is corn, green is soy. This is about 583 square miles. You can see a couple of ponds, a little bit of woodland along the sides of these streams, a couple of towns here, and the majority of this 583 square miles is in corn and soybean. 63% of the total land area of Iowa is in corn and soybean, and 82% of our cropland. So I'm going to show you a very short film clip of what that looks like on the ground at one of the farms where I work. So this is about 2 counties north of me, and we're going to do a 360 pivot from the middle of this field. So you do see some trees. It's not devoid of anything other than corn, but there's quite a bit of it. Okay. All right, so we've created this very species-poor landscape, for lack of a better term. And the important thing to understand there is it was not always so. So if you look at the Raccoon River Basin, which is the river system that with the Des Moines River feeds the city of Des Moines, you can see that as late as the 1950s, about 40% of the area in that watershed was occupied by perennial hay crops like alfalfa and mixed grass clover. And 30% of the area was occupied by small grains, principally oats, but some other things as well. And then that's dropped precipitously to be replaced almost exclusively by corn and soy. Concomitantly, we've seen the loss of about half the cattle in the Corn Belt since, I'll say, the mid-1960s until the present day. Most of those cattle have moved west to Kansas, eastern Colorado, North Texas, Oklahoma. So, whereas before we had a lot of reason to have perennial forage crops on that landscape, now most of that ground has been converted to row crops. So as a biologist, one of the things that I'm interested in is how many parts of a biological community can we tolerate losing? And what are the consequences of nearly eliminating deep-rooted perennial vegetation that provides continuous living cover? And I once heard a talk by Shahid Naim that I think gives you an appreciation for how this issue plays out. So here's your motherboard in your computer, right? And it has a lot of parts. And if I had a computer and I told you that it's got, several hundred parts, and then I said, well, then I've got this pair of needle nose pliers and I'm going to reach in there and randomly take out 5 of those parts. And of course you want that computer back, right? Because it has a lot of parts and you can learn to live with fewer parts, right? Well, as biologists and ecologists are finding out, removing a lot of those parts does affect the function of agroecosystems and other ecosystems. So a recent review of the world literature and crop rotation would indicate that for crops like soybean, moving from a more diverse rotation sequence where you have multiple crops in the sequence to continuous soy or only one other crop would reduce yields 8 to 20%. And for corn, that reduction is on the order of 7 to 36%. And you can see for crops like upland rice, up to 54% reduction, for potatoes, 10 to 30%. So this is a worldwide review. It'll vary from place to place, but the point is that biological diversity has an enormous impact on crop productivity, and that by moving to very simplified systems with continuous corn or just corn and soy, we are giving up some of our yield potential. That doesn't mean we're necessarily giving up the economic potential under that set of conditions, but biologically we're not necessarily maximizing productivity. All right, so let me tell you about another critical structure-function relationship that affects where I live and where I work, and it involves crop and non-crop vegetation, water movement, and nitrogen. So in Iowa, like much of central Indiana, central Illinois, western Ohio, southern Minnesota, we have this subsurface drainage system. It's called tile. And basically what you have is pipes that are perforated to allow water to move in, and because that water can move quickly, it removes standing water in the field relatively quickly and creates more oxygen and fosters the growth of roots and can increase crop productivity. We have about 1 million miles of subsurface drainage tile in Iowa. And those small pipes turn into big pipes. You can see the scale here. There's somebody standing in this, what they call a main, and it's discharging, and this ditch was dug by hand about 100 years ago. And it's quite large. It has a number, and it eventually will discharge into the Des Moines River. Okay, so this is coming from a field network over here. Eventually this water is going to move out and it'll move down. And what does that mean in terms of nutrient movement? Well, just to illustrate, I'll use some results from an experiment where we combined a number of different species to make what we call a reconstructed prairie. We put in 30 species characteristic of the original vegetation, and we grew them together, and you can see them here. Right? So this is essentially the perennial grassland mixed with flowering plants that were native to this area, this county. And we also had reconstructed prairie where we put on a lot of fertilizer. And then we compared the performance of those reconstructed prairies with corn plots. And we had a monitoring system to look at the quantity and quality of water flowing out in the subsurface drainage below each of those types of vegetation. So we have cropland, then we have native perennial deep-rooted species that provide continuous living cover. Okay, so here's data from 4 years, and corn is in C, soybean is in S with this orange color, continuous corn is with these yellow triangles, and you can see the prairie and the continuous prairie with fertilizer are these blue lines. So even though we put all this fertilizer on the prairie plots, the amount of nitrate nitrogen draining through to these drainage tiles was about a pound per acre per year, even when we added fertilizer. Okay? And you can see here, depending on the year, we were losing somewhere between 15 and almost 40 pounds or kilos of nitrogen, kilos per hectare or pounds per acre. So this is the dominant vegetation, right, over most of Iowa, bleeding nutrients. And this is the reconstructed prairie with or without fertilizer, which is very retentive of the nutrients. So the kind of vegetation, the structure of that ecosystem will affect its function. And that gets expressed through lots of monitoring around the Midwest. So this is from southwestern Minnesota, from Giles Randall. You can see that the average nitrate nitrogen loss in pounds per acre per year was 46 to 49 for continuous corn and soybean, versus for alfalfa and a mixture of perennial grasses and alfalfa, it's on the same order of 1 to 2 pounds a year. So the type of vegetation you have affects the function of that ecosystem in terms of nutrient discharge. U.S. Geological Survey says that somewhere between 10 and 25 to 30 pounds of nitrogen in nitrate form is lost from this central area of the Corn Belt. And this is the area that has most of the tile drainage. So it's leaking out of the dominant cropping system, and as it turns out, it winds up in the water. And you all have heard about the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, but we also have it locally in Iowa. The Des Moines Water Works was spending $7,000 to $9,000 a day to remove nitrate out of the water supply, with which it serves 500,000 people in the area. And they got upset enough that they filed a lawsuit against 3 counties up the Raccoon River for discharging nitrate into the tile system that eventually winds up in Des Moines. The suit was just thrown out by a federal judge over a debate about whether this is runoff or drainage. I won't get into the details, but it's a highly charged political issue in much of the central Corn Belt. And it's a function not just of fertilizer management, but of the type of vegetation that we have over most of the landscape. So what I want to talk about for the rest of the period today is 2 experiments that I've been involved in. These are multi-investigator projects. One of them that looks at diversification with both crops and livestock, and another one that looks at diversifying crop landscapes with non-crop vegetation within the field or on the field margins. And both of these are to address environmental quality issues, but we'll touch a little bit on some other things, the agronomics and the economics of these systems. All right, so the first system I want to talk about looks at cropping system diversification and crop livestock integration in the same way that I showed you historically. We had large numbers of ruminants, cattle in particular, feeding on forage crops and small grains, in addition to soybean and corn. And this experiment, which is conducted in Boone County in central Iowa, asks whether we can reduce requirements for purchased inputs, whether we can maintain or improve crop productivity, whether we can reduce susceptibility to certain crop diseases, and whether we can improve the environmental performance of agriculture by diversifying the crop vegetation and integrating crop and livestock production. So this experiment is done at the university's Marsden farm. It occupies about 25 acres of land. It involves a 2-year rotation. This would be the more or less conventional cash grain system of corn and soy, but it also compares 3-year and 4-year rotations with oats and red clover or oats and alfalfa hay. So all of these treatments are present every year in these rotation plots. And it started out in 2001 and 2002 with baseline sampling. 2003 through 2005 I would consider our startup period, and since that time, where we've gone through each of the rotation multiple times, we've been putting more stock in those data because they reflected differences in the performance of the soil and crop systems that are fairly marked. The plots are each 60 by 275 feet. We use anywhere between 4-row and 12-row equipment, but this work is done by machine rather than by hand. All right, our sponsors range from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to the Iowa Soybean Association to the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, a reasonably diverse portfolio of people who are interested in this work. All right, so diversification is reflected not just by oats and alfalfa or oats and clover, but also the fact that preceding corn in those 3- and 4-year rotations where we have clover and alfalfa, we put on composted manure at 7 tons an acre once every 3 or once every 4 years. Nitrogen in these plots is added through biological nitrogen fixation. The clover and the alfalfa are taking nitrogen out of the air and putting it in their roots, and the residues of those plants contribute nitrogen. And nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium and some other nutrients are recycled through manure application. So our mineral nitrogen fertilizer use in this 11-year period of 2006 through 2016 has been reduced between 86 and 91%. So these are not organic plots. We don't put any nitrogen down at planting in these 3- and 4-year rotations, but we will add mineral fertilizer nitrogen if test results indicate we need to add some more. These small figures here reflect the application of monoammonium phosphate. So we use some mineral forms of phosphorus and potassium as well. But you can see the rotation averages reflect a pretty large reduction in reliance on mineral nitrogen fertilizer. In spite of using a lot less fertilizer, our yields have statistically been higher for corn in the 3- and the 4-year rotations relative to the 2-year rotation. So we haven't given anything up. And this spans years of drought, years of hail, years of flooding. So we have a pretty wide range of environmental conditions, and these results have been pretty robust. And the results indicate that corn has been yielding about 4 or 5% more in the more diverse systems, though we're still adding nitrogen in the form of legume residues and manure. We've reduced our reliance on mineral fertilizer. What about soybean? So in 2010, it was very clear that these soybeans were a lot greener and experiencing a lot less disease than these soybeans over here, which are losing their leaves and losing their photosynthetic potential in mid-August when they should be doing a lot of photosynthesis and filling seeds. So I started collaborating with a group of plant pathologists to understand the ecology of a disease called sudden death syndrome, which is caused by a soil-borne fungus called Fusarium virgiliforme, and it infects the roots and rots the roots, but it also injects a toxin which moves up into the plant and causes all that yellowing and death of the leaves, and you lose the canopy and you lose the photosynthetic potential. And yield losses in a cool, wet year, which favor the buildup of the pathogen, can be pretty severe. So here's 6 years of data. 2012 is a drought year, okay? So there's not much disease going on in 2012 because it's not conducive to the disease conditions. But the 2-year rotation, the incidence and the severity are shown in black. And the 3- and the 4-year rotation are shown in this gray color and the white color. And you can see a big drop in incidence and severity in every year where we have the pathogen at any reasonable level. And that's row to row, 275 feet long, in plots that all we're doing differently is managing the vegetation through time with a longer rotation and adding some manure. And when we come back and we look at the yields, there's a 19% higher soybean yield in the 3- and the 4-year rotation relative to the 2-year rotation. So that begins to turn into some real money. All right, what about environmental quality indicators? So we've looked at a suite of these, and I'll just give you a little bit of a quick tour. And there are more of these things that we're working on, but it'll give you an idea of some of the impacts of these practices on the environment. So if you look at the amount of fossil energy embodied in fuel for tractor operations or combine operation or fertilizer or the chemicals that we use to control pests or the seed production of crops like corn and the drying energy that takes to dry corn seed in a wet year, those are the major forms of energy that are embodied, that fossil energy takes in Iowa cropping systems. And there's more than a 50% reduction in the amount of fossil energy that we use in the 3 and the 4 year rotation relative to the 2 year rotation. And just as point of comparison, this figure on a per acre per year, or excuse me, well, if you translated gigajoules per hectare per year, this would represent about 0.6 barrels of oil equivalent, or 25 gallons of diesel equivalent per acre. Okay, so we've reduced the amount of fossil energy going into this 3 and the 4 year system because of reductions in these categories. All right, in terms of sheet and rill erosion, this particular site is relatively flat with a 1 to 2% slope, but we do get flooding events and we do get some soil movement. But based on the revised universal soil loss equation, we can estimate that there's a 22% reduction in erosion potential for the 3 year rotation relative to the 2 year rotation and a 40% reduction in the 4 year system relative to the 2 year system. The so-called T value in Iowa would be somewhere 4 to 5 tons per acre, which is approximately 10 times the rate of soil formation. So reducing erosion even to these low levels is necessary. A couple of other soil quality indicators. One is particulate organic matter, carbon. This is the fraction of organic matter that is most responsible to reductions in tillage and additions of organic matter amendments to soil. And you can see there's about a 25 to 35% increase in the amount of particulate organic matter carbon in the 3 and the 4 year systems relative to the 2 year system. There's more microbial biomass carbon. We have a larger microbial community in the 3 and the 4 year system than the 2 year system. And we have more potentially mineralizable nitrogen, which is a laboratory assay that allows you to look at the nitrogen release power from the soil itself, not just the fertilizer that you're applying. And this is the fraction of the soil that may keep your corn crop greener later in the season when you're filling grain and give you that extra 4 to 5% yield margin. All right, so another thing we've done, I worked with Mark Tomer at the USDA ARS lab to look at drainage water concentrations in shallow lysimeters at about 3 foot depth in these plots. These plots are not pattern tiled. We can't extract water out of tiles and measure the concentrations of nitrogen and make them flow proportional, but we can collect water samples in cups underneath the drainage of the roots and look at the concentrations. And what you see here is that in the spring, which is when much of the nitrate contamination of drainage water occurs, we go from 17 parts per million nitrate nitrogen in the 2 year system down to 4 parts per million in the 4 year system. And the 3 year system is intermediate. Later in the season, when the small grains and the legumes are growing, or during the hay portion of the 4 year rotation, these concentrations are below 5 and often below 1. So in the fall, in the 3 and the 4 year systems, that ground that's occupied by red clover or by alfalfa is doing a very good job at retaining nitrogen. So we don't have conclusive proof that these systems are going to fix the water quality problem, but basically where you have a deep-rooted perennial crop like alfalfa, you prevent the loss of nitrogen into the drainage water. So to the extent that we can put more of these perennial forages in the landscape, we're going to do better things for water quality. All right, I've worked with a group at the University of Minnesota in the Ag Engineering Department there with a life cycle assessment model called ecotox, where we can calculate the projected effect on aquatic organisms from herbicides that move through air, water, and soil to water where those organisms might live. So this is not going to tell you how many organisms are actually going to die, but it would tell you the potential for loss of aquatic organisms exposed to concentrations that are commensurate with the amount of herbicides we're using in our plots. And you can see that there's a reduction in herbicide load as you move from the 2-year system where both corn and soybean are sprayed to the 3-year system and the 4-year system where the oats and the alfalfa and the oats and the clover are not sprayed at all. So there's a proportional reduction in a conventional herbicide system just by growing crops that you don't spray with herbicides. And then if you move to a low herbicide regime where you use low-dose products applied in bands over crop rows in corn and soybean, and you cultivate between the rows, you can reduce that load up to 96%. So if we wanted to get more aggressive about reducing the herbicide load on the water system in Iowa, we have tools that we can do that with. What about labor and economics? So I work with Ann Johans, who's the extension economist who builds what are called the Ag Decision Maker enterprise budget sheets. And she does the numbers for all the field operations and all the materials that we work with every year on every plot. And then she looks at the returns based on selling those crops at market prices for north central Iowa and subtracts from those the production costs. So this is returns to land and management. So we're not paying a fee for land here. We're not spending money on the time it takes to market grain in these calculations. But this gives you some idea of what's going on in terms of more labor being required in the longer rotations than in the 2-year rotation. Higher gross returns in the 2-year corn-soybean system than the more diverse systems, but higher production costs. So when we look at the outcome of subtracting the production costs from the gross returns, you can see that statistically there's no difference between these systems. They're equivalent in terms of the profitability, and numerically they're slightly higher in the longer rotations. So to conclude this portion of the talk, you can look at these studies in more detail in these 2 articles that are open access, but we found that cropping system diversity and the reintegration of crop and livestock production can balance productivity, profitability, and environmental health. That there's a way to do things differently that requires us to change some of the aspects of our cropping systems, but we can work with crops that have a historic presence in Iowa, and we can enhance environmental quality. And we'll talk a little bit about what incentives might be required to get there at the end of the hour. All right, so the second topic I want to address is whether diversifying annual cropland by converting small areas to prairie vegetation, the native, deep-rooted perennial cover, can provide conservation benefits that are disproportionately greater than the land area converted. So if you look at the climate change assessments for the north central states, of which Iowa is included, this report indicated that one of the clearest trends in the U.S. observational record is the increasing frequency and intensity of heavy precipitation events. Over the last century, there's a 50% increase in the frequency of days with precipitation over 4 inches in the upper Midwestern U.S. So this is a relatively flat field. It's saturated. The water has nowhere to go. It's already completely loaded the subsurface drainage system, and that water is now flowing across the surface of that gently undulating field and carving a big rut and moving a lot of sediment that is not going to contribute to water quality farther downstream. So it's a problem for the farmer, obviously, to suffer that kind of erosive loss, but it's also a problem for society because folks downstream bear an increase in sediment load in reservoirs and such, and that sediment carries phosphorus and other nutrients that lead to water contamination. All right, so the disproportionate benefits hypothesis that a group of us at Iowa State have been working with is basically this nonlinear relationship where small changes give you a rapid increase in environmental benefits. As you change a proportion of the landscape from crops to perennials, you get this big gain, and then it begins to level off towards some asymptote. But changing a small amount of the environment doesn't get you all the way to some natural state, but it gets you farther along towards what might be improved soil, water, and nature conservation. So why did we think about prairie? Well, first of all, it's perennial cover, which is really good for controlling erosion in the spring and in the fall. It's got deep roots, which we talked about being important for transpiring water that would otherwise drain and carry nutrients towards subsurface drainage or ultimately into surface channels. It's got stiff stems that remain erect in pounding rain. So if you look at many of the cool season perennial grasses that we use in grass waterways, they're designed to convey water, right? Holds onto soil, but water flows down a grass waterway. Prairie vegetation has stiff stems that remain erect and actually impede the movement of water and allow it to deposit sediment on the upslope side of that vegetation before it moves. And as we'll see in a minute, it enhances infiltration and reduces runoff by impeding the movement of water downslope. Okay, it can be diverse, and that diversity of plants contributes to diversity of things like butterflies and pollinators, and that's something that we've come up against as a problem in the Midwest. And it's native. Okay, so for those people who are trying to conserve native biodiversity, this is one of the forms of native vegetation that grows well in our areas and is able to put up with years of drought, years of flood, severe winters, or mild winters. Okay, so our project is called STRIPS, Science-Based Trials of Row Crops Integrated with Prairie Strips. If you want to find out more about it on the web, go to prairiestrips.org. We have a little logo. We have a whole bunch of people from private philanthropic organizations to a variety of federal agencies and state agencies that have supported this work. So it started out with a research and demonstration project in small experimental watersheds ranging from about 1 to 8 acres in size on the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge near Prairie City, Iowa. And this was an area that was going to become a nuclear power plant. They were going to convert cropland to a power plant, and Congressman Neil Smith stepped in and said, no, let's not do that. Let's create the largest reconstructed tallgrass prairie in the country. And they brought in bison and elk and had been converting up to about 7,000 acres of cropland to native species. And in the meantime, local farmers rent this land at a very low rate from the wildlife refuge and produce crops before they're converted back to prairie. So the experimental treatments range from all crops. This egg shape represents a watershed. This is the top of the watershed. This is the bottom. And the yellowish color is no-till corn and soybeans. And the green color is reconstructed prairie in different proportions and in different positions within these watersheds. And the proportions range from 10% at the bottom or distributed up the watershed to 20% distributed throughout the watershed. These are done on slopes ranging from 6 to 11% in catchments that range in size from about 1 to 8 acres. They're managed by a commercial farmer under conventional no-till production. You can see here he's burning down the vegetation in this field with herbicides, but this prairie strip is on the slope, and as water moves down the slope from top to bottom, it's intercepted by this 30-foot band of prairie vegetation. You can see it a little bit better here. So this is from the top of the watershed down to this H flume where we're collecting the amount of water and sediment moving out of the bottom. We can intercept that water here, here, and here before it's discharged, and the sediment that it contains is trapped and the nutrients are deposited on the upslope side of these filter strips. And we have groundwater wells where we can look at nitrate concentrations below the soil surface as well. So just to give you a little taste of the results, we started in 2003 doing background measurements of soil and hydrologic conditions. We planted crops in prairie in 2007. 2008 was a major flood year in Iowa. We suffered about $8 billion worth of damage, particularly in eastern Iowa. And where we had 100% row crops, we lost about 20,000 kilos per hectare of soil. And where we had Prairie strips, the first year after establishment, we had about a 95% reduction in the amount of sediment emitted from the bottom of the catchments. And 2010 was a flood year, but it came in August. And you can see these other years that were a bit more normal. The proportional reduction in sediment loss is very consistent out of these watersheds. The amount that we lose is dependent on how much rain we have and when it came, but the sediment trapping effect of these conservation strips was really marked. So we had over a 95% reduction in sediment export from the watersheds with the prairie filter strips. We found no influence on the per acre yield in the cropped areas of the watershed. So obviously, if you take 10% of the watershed out of crop production, you lose yield. There's a cost associated with not growing crops in that area. But we didn't experience any yield loss relative to the all-crop watersheds in the cropped areas. And we didn't have any additional weed issues in the areas adjacent to these prairie strips. So we weren't infesting them with new weeds because we had non-crop vegetation nearby. But they were managed conventionally and they were sprayed, and we went out of our way to kill the weeds. All right, so what are some of the other benefits? I'll just go through these quickly, but we have a paper in press and you should be able to read these in more detail in some of the other papers that have come out of the project. So we've had about a 20-fold reduction in soil sediment coming out of the bottom of the watersheds relative to this dotted line here, which is the 1-to-1 all-crop watershed reference point. We've had about a 12-fold increase in the number of native perennials, and you would expect that because we're planting strips of native perennials. Phosphorus retention has increased more than 4-fold. Nitrate retention in the subsurface drainage water has increased about 375%, almost 4-fold. Nitrogen retention in the surface runoff, about 3-fold increase in retention. And then water infiltration has been increased because water is moving more slowly down the slope and has more time to percolate in above the filter strips. We've also seen increases in the species richness of birds and pollinator insects and natural enemies of insect pests like soybean aphid. And we have not seen an increase or any change in weed infestations of the cropland. And as you would expect, if you take 10% of the cropped area out of production, you lose some crop yield. All right, so stage 2 of this has been to move from these small watersheds out into commercial farms around Iowa. We have now 6 instrumented paired watershed sites, courtesy of the federal government, shown in these red stars. This is our original site east of Des Moines. Now we have these other sites in different places in Iowa. Then we have cooperating farms that have voluntarily chosen to put these prairie strips on their own commercial farms with some cost share support from CRP and EQIP and pollinator programs through NRCS and Farm Services Agency. So this is now where we're sort of beta testing this approach to see, can we scale up to what commercial farms could do? And every farm is different, and they all have different schemes for layout, and we help them locate these strips on their farm in such a way that it doesn't interfere with the operation of farm equipment. Some of these farms are organic, some of them are no-till conventional. So we span the whole range. And here's a collaborator in Tama County. We've tried to call attention to our project with these signs, and we've been able, with some private philanthropic foundation support, to build groups of these cooperators that communicate with each other. So we want to have farmers helping farmers do this, and ultimately have the farmers be the promoters and the communicators. And it's been really popular. So a little bit about policy before I finish up. One of my colleagues in rural sociology at Iowa State and one of my economics colleagues have done surveys of several thousand Iowans where they've asked them, what are their priorities? This is both the agricultural population and the non-agricultural population. They asked them, what are your priorities for agricultural policy? If we had funding to do some things differently in our agricultural sector, what would be important to you? And you can see the word water shows up a lot. Drinking water quality for aquatic life, jobs, flood control, water quality for recreation, game wildlife habitat, reduction of greenhouse gases related to climate change, tourism, crop production, and non-game wildlife habitat. Okay, so this is, a snapshot of what the broader Iowa public, including farmers, is interested in and how they set priorities for agricultural policy. And we've done a relatively poor job in Iowa actually moving this forward, but we did vote 6 years ago that the next time we raise the sales tax, 3/8 of a cent of each increased dollar that we raise would go towards improving environmental quality. We just haven't done that yet. We do have federal programs available, and if you look at the costs of conservation relative to doing things like terracing and a lot of engineering solutions that people are talking about to improve water quality, putting in these prairie strips is relatively cost effective. And we figure for about a 10-to-1 ratio of treated acres to planted acres of prairie, right, it costs about $25 to $40 per treated acre. And if you use these cost share programs that exist on the books now, you can reduce that to about $5 per treated acre. So some farmers are taking advantage of this, and there are some really important opportunities as farm bills are thought through and drafted to provide more opportunity for conservation. The other thing to understand is that the Farm Bill provides a lot of money to Iowa and other agricultural states. So if you look at the period of time from 1995 to 2014, between commodity subsidies and crop insurance subsidies, we were spending about, more than $20 billion in Iowa alone on those programs, relative to about $4 billion in conservation programs. So all told, that's about $1.3 billion a year. So it's not that there's no money in Iowa to do things. It's a question of what we spend money on. Okay? The United States, in general, we spend about $16.1 billion a year on various programs related to commodities, but also conservation. And if farmers were compensated more or less in the same level that they're being compensated now, you can shift the balance around and maintain farm revenue, but get a lot more conservation. So this is a decision that you all get to make when you vote, because you're taxpayers and you're ultimately funding all of this. There are things that are definitely possible by working with farmers to improve learning and access to the kind of information that they need to develop these conservation programs. And there are also opportunities coming forward with a number of companies that are looking for ways to differentiate their product, and they range from McDonald's to Purdue Farms to General Mills to Cargill, and all the smaller companies like Ben & Jerry's and Chobani that are interested in developing a greener footprint for their agriculture. And we are having conversations with those people now to see what they might do. U.S. consumers spend about $1.3 trillion a year in food every year, and about 2/3 of that accrues to the processing, distribution, and retail sector. So when those people ask their farmers who are supplying them with commodities to produce those commodities in a different way, you have the opportunity to make some changes in farming practices. So I'm going to stop there and provide some time for questions. You can see our prairie strips on a hillside in Tama County, and none of this work would be possible without a large number of colleagues, a few of whom are listed here. And I thank them profusely, and I thank you for your attention.
Very good. We got 10 minutes or so for questions.
So, boy, it's a great presentation. Thank you. I get the same sense from the first half of your presentation, looking at diversifying the landscape to our potato system, our potato grain system that we're timeframe really kind of stuck in. And my question to you is, since the livestock has moved out of Iowa, and the livestock has really moved out of northern Maine, how do you promote the red clover and the other things when there's really not a market? If we can figure that out, we might get some.
Yeah. So I was asked to repeat the question for some visitor who's observing us or taping later. So the question is, how do we put perennial vegetation back in the landscape, or how do we diversify the landscape when we've lost the ruminants that can consume forage? Yeah, it's a really tough question, and in Iowa we approached it in a couple of different ways. So one way is set aside, and there are some interesting developments in Iowa using precision agriculture technologies. We can begin to compare productivity with profitability on a subfield level. And with yield monitors and a program run by a company called AgSolver, we can actually calculate on a 10-foot by 10-foot square across a whole field where people are making back the cost of production and where they're not. And based on some of the calculations that have been done with these precision ag technologies and some of the financial spreadsheets linked to them, about 8 to 15% of the corn and soybean area in Iowa where we're growing crops is not making back the variable cost of production. So you're spending money on fertilizer, seed, pesticides, whatever, and you're not making it back. So the set-aside argument, you don't even have to invoke federal cost share to show farmers that they would make more money on a field basis by not planting those areas of the field that are not yielding enough to make back the cost of production, or putting them in something else, whether it's hay or. Okay, so that's one option, right? Finances. And if you have cost share to do set aside, you can maybe do that. Another one is trying to bring the livestock industry back, and there are people interested in doing that. And the third option, which varies in possibilities and optimism depending on where we are, is developing a perennial biomass energy industry. And that could be pelletizing perennial vegetation and burning it and generating electricity or heat directly, or it could involve a lignocellulosic conversion to liquid fuel. And next to my town, I have a $250 million plant which has been scheduled to produce ethanol from corn stalks for the last 3 years. Hasn't done it yet. They're collecting bales of corn stover from 200,000 acres, and they're stacked up over the 4-county area around me. But, it hasn't happened. But if we were to get to the point where we could identify those areas of fields that were not making money in corn and soy, and where we could do some harvesting without degrading soil carbon, we could produce biomass fairly regularly, and we could combust it for energy, or we could turn it into liquid fuel. So that's an option, but it hasn't come to fruition yet.
Really interesting, very interesting. So one of the things that's fascinating about putting in the rows is that's about change, and the comfort level people feel about the change. And there's some interesting work done by faculty here at U of Maine where they looked at change, like say in terms of wind power, and whether people were ready for that or not. And they framed it in different ways. One of the ways they framed it is Mainers have always been people who do innovative things. And they looked at whether the framing made a difference in terms of people's willingness and understanding and interest in making these kinds of changes. What are your thoughts about whether that would work in Iowa and whether that's being tried?
So the question relates to how do we frame these issues in such a way people are motivated to change. So we've had an intense focus on water quality in Iowa over the last 5 years in particular, with regular stories in the Des Moines Register and the lawsuit that I mentioned, and a huge amount of acrimony. Regardless of your position on whether the lawsuit was a good idea, it did tend to concentrate the mind of people in the agricultural sector. And as a consequence of that, 2 or 3 years ago, Illinois, Iowa, and Minnesota each developed a nutrient reduction strategy. And a science-based report evaluating options was developed. It was linked to various economic consequences of that. And the point was that people began to think about if they were to do things voluntarily to avoid litigation and regulation, what could they do? So that's been a shift in the discussion within the agricultural community. The farmers would like to be proactive and not regulated. And I think the amount of public attention on the issue has led many people to feel like I am at least partially responsible for this project. I'm going to do my part. So, yeah. With regard to energy, I think Iowa now gets between 25 and 35% of its electricity from wind generation. And that's been sold purely on economics. And our farmers like wind generators, and Alliant Energy has gone to many European countries, and you see wind turbines moving up and down the highway all the time, and that's a function of energy independence for Iowa, and the fact that farmers get paid quite handsomely for leasing their land for wind generators. So we don't have a lot of the controversy about landscapes. I mean, I think many people would rather see a wind turbine than a coal-fired generating plant. Is that enough, or should we talk more about how you motivate people? I think, you know, the motivation to do something different is driven in part by market opportunities, and if people see that doing things different can confer some sort of price premium or a new marketing opportunity for them, they're interested in that. So I wouldn't deny that. I think, yeah, saving money, making a little bit more money, both of those things tend to attract people. There was a question over here.
So to answer to kind of help answering the first question, there is actually a four option, which actually is already existing, is exporting of hay to Asia. So Japan, China, South Korea, and even some Middle Eastern countries, they buy a lot of hay from the US. And there are already a big industry in Oregon, California, Arizona that export hay to those areas. And even I read 2 years ago there was a grant from the USDA to explore the possibility of exporting hay on the eastern coast. So that could be another option, but it will have to be a high quality. Since in China, for example, they don't have too much potential to produce forage, or not for the dairy industry. So that I think there is a market there that can be explored. If the forage is of high quality like your alfalfa, that's a good option, or the clover.
Yeah, the problem, okay, so the opportunity was discussed was exporting forage to countries that can use it. Yeah. Moving commodities around becomes a little bit expensive. So, you know, we do export about 12% of the corn out of Iowa. About 40 to 50% of it goes to ethanol production, and much of the co-product called dry distiller grains and solubles is exported out of state. Some of it to China and other countries as a protein concentrate or higher protein feed. Yeah, I think it is possible to export, but I'm also interested in localizing consumption and being maybe a little bit less dependent on long-distance transport. And I think retaining value within the state through the livestock industry might be a good way to do that. Chris?
Now, given the economic zone in the Gulf of Mexico, do you know if discussions or litigation has arisen between the fishing community and the farmers in the Corn Belt?
So the question is there litigation between farmers in the Gulf of Mexico and farmers in the Corn Belt? No. And part of that is it's very difficult to identify who's responsible. So this lawsuit that I mentioned from the Des Moines Water Works was predicated on the fact that because of these large discharge mains for the subsurface drainage, U.S. Geological Survey has been able to monitor concentrations and flow at distinct point discharge kind of outlets over an extended period of time. Moreover, the areas that were involved in this lawsuit have very low populations in any kind of cities and towns, so almost the entire landscape was responsible for the discharge. Being managed in agriculture was clearly involved. But that's very difficult to tie back to individuals. So the lawsuit involved drainage districts, which were congruent with these counties. And even then, it became very difficult to identify whether this subsurface drainage was really a point discharge or was exempted by the Clean Water Act as agricultural runoff. And the judgment was that agricultural runoff is exempt from the Clean Water Act, and therefore what really is subsurface drainage coming out of a point discharge was not judged a suitable way to enter into this problem. So I think because it's very difficult to identify who is actually impacting water quality, it's a diffuse set of pollution sources, it's going to be really hard until you get some injunction. There are precedents for it. So in the late 80s, there was a drainage project that came up from the south end of the San Joaquin Valley that discharged into Kesterson National Wildlife Refuge. And as it turned out, the drainage of the south end of this valley was very rich in selenium, and they didn't build through the drainage canal that ultimately would have discharged into San Pablo Bay or San Francisco Bay. And they discharged all the water coming out of the south end of the San Joaquin, rich in selenium, into a wildlife refuge and killed all the wildlife. And because it's on a national flyway, it was subject to federal law. There was an injunction and they had to block all the drainage on the west side of the San Joaquin Valley that discharged into this drainage canal. So, you know, sometimes it happens. In this case, it doesn't seem like we have the political will to do that.
Oh,
Matt, you have been talking about water quality, but I was wondering about water availability. And is that limiting at all in these Iowa systems? And how does that affect long-term sustainability from an economic perspective?
The question related to water quantity rather than water quality. Do we have enough water in Iowa? There was some concern when ethanol plants were going up very quickly. They used somewhere between, I think, 3 or 4 gallons of water to produce each gallon of ethanol. And we've stopped building ethanol plants, so that's a little less important. Almost all of our acreage is rain-fed, so we're not irrigating, with small exceptions in the eastern part of the state. So we're really dependent on rainfall. And the dominant trend over the last 50 years has been about a 25% increase in precipitation, most of it coming in late spring when the soils are really subject to erosion. So one of the conversations we're having now is that the dominant corn and soybean system evolved under a different climate regime. And even though you can use no-till production conditions, when you enter into a situation where you get 4 or 5 inches of rain in a day on top of saturated soil, essentially all the residue that's parked on the soil surface just floats away. And then the soil is bare, and any more of the rain coming down would tear the soil. So we need other types of tools in the toolbox to deal with excesses of precipitation. We do have occasional droughts, and that's been predicted as, you know, part of the increasing weather and climate variability. 2012 was a major drought year, and you know, we're likely to have that again. But in general, it seems like the pattern is how we cope with more water rather than less.
Take one more question from Matt.
Do you see this getting picked up on a scale large enough to make a real regional difference to the landscape? And if you do, or maybe even if you don't see that happening, how did you do your farmer-to-farmer networking, information sharing? That sounds like a really successful model.
So the question is, can we pick this up on a more regional scale, and how that relates to farmer-to-farmer networking?
How did you implement the farmer-to-farmer network?
So the farmers came to us, and we just tried to be very public about what we did. And we convened field days, and we go to all the winter meetings, and we told people about what we do, and we brought them to our experimental catchments, and then we sort of put the word out, if you're interested, we'll help you do this. And many folks, more folks asked for assistance than we can provide it yet, but we're trying to build out. With regard to kind of regional monitoring, there are some really interesting things being done with remote sensing now. So this past week, Environmental Working Group and Practical Farmers of Iowa released a report based on NVDI spectra, looking at cover crop coverage of the central corn belt. And you can actually pick out different types of vegetation, winter cover crops from corn residue, soybean residue, and other things, and figure out what percentage of the corn soy acres are being actively cover cropped. In Iowa, it's less than 3% right now. And they have the data to be able to say, you know, these fields have changed over the last several years or not. The watersheds I show you originally in that strips project, I can find in Google Earth. Okay, I can see the strips in Google Earth, and we can pick up points of the landscape where those kind of conservation practices are evident, and we could probably develop some sort of imaging analysis system to pick those up. So I think we're a long way away from all of Iowa, you know, having the option to do this. I mean, it's sort of, we're going one farm at a time, and that's why we want to develop a network of farmers who can teach other farmers and kind of build out the practice from the experience we get on commercial farms before we make too many more mistakes. But I think ultimately, farmers are our biggest promoters, and when they see the reduction in erosion on their own farms and they see the reduction in the amount of sediment coming down, they become enthusiastic supporters. In the same way that, you know, people have adopted cover crops with enthusiasm and made it work. You know, so it's going to take a little while, but ultimately there's only so much you can do from an extension or a research point of view. You have to work with the folks who are actually going to make their living and implement. So thanks very much for your attention.